Commissioner Gordon, Bane has escaped.
Your mind keeps returning to certain ideas, certain paths, certain visions of who you could become. That repetition is not random. It is not fantasy. It is a signal from a deeper layer of awareness that knows you are capable of more than you are expressing. Ignoring that signal does not silence it. It only turns it into frustration. You feel that frustration when you watch others take risks you secretly admire. You feel it when you catch yourself over-explaining decisions you do not fully believe in. You feel it when rest does not refresh you anymore. These are not signs of exhaustion. They are signs of underuse. Power that is not expressed turns inward and becomes discomfort. The solution is not to escape that feeling, but to follow it. To ask what action you have been postponing. To identify where you have been negotiating with your own potential. Once you name that, the path becomes obvious, even if it is uncomfortable. Discomfort is not the enemy here. It is the toll you pay to cross into a larger version of yourself. You have spent too much time proving that you can endure. Endurance is no longer the lesson, expression is. You already know how to survive pressure. What you have not fully practiced is how to apply pressure of your own. That requires a different relationship with conflict, with visibility, with authority. It means allowing yourself to be seen in your certainty, not just in your competence. Certainty unsettles people because it removes negotiation. When you act with certainty, others must respond. They can no longer ignore you. That is why certainty feels risky. It exposes you to reaction. But reaction is feedback, and feedback is how influence grows. You cannot lead from the shadows of your own life. Leadership begins the moment you stop hiding behind preparation and step into execution. Execution clarifies everything. It reveals what works, what does not, and where you need to adjust. Endless thinking only creates the illusion of control. Action creates actual leverage. What you call caution has quietly become self-distrust. You double-check instincts that have already proven accurate. You wait for consensus before honoring your own judgment. This pattern weakens decision-making over time. Confidence is not built by avoiding mistakes. It is built by recovering from them quickly. Each delayed decision reinforces the belief that you cannot be trusted with authority over your own life. Reversing this requires deliberate action taken without complete certainty. You decide, you move, you observe, you refine. That cycle restores trust in yourself. Once self-trust returns, external opinions lose their grip. You no longer need agreement to proceed. You only need alignment. Alignment feels calm, not euphoric. It feels inevitable. That calm is what people recognize as presence. Presence is not volume. It is coherence. When your actions match your internal direction, you become difficult to ignore. Not because you demand attention, but because you carry weight. There is a quiet habit that settles into people without asking permission, a habit that feels like patience, but behaves like surrender. It shows up as waiting for better timing, waiting for clarity, waiting for someone else to move first. You tell yourself you are being careful, thoughtful, strategic. What is really happening is far less dramatic and far more dangerous. You have trained yourself to live beneath your capacity because it feels safer there. You have learned how to shrink your voice just enough to avoid resistance, how to dull your ambition so it does not attract attention, how to call it humility when it is really hesitation. This pattern does not arrive in a single moment. It is built slowly through compromise after compromise, through moments where you knew you could push harder but chose comfort instead. The tragedy is not that you were afraid. Fear is expected. The tragedy is that you began to trust fear as if it were wisdom. Over time, you stopped asking what you could become and started asking what you could get away with. That question alone redraws the limits of a life. When a person lives that way, they do not collapse. They drift. They remain functional enough to avoid alarm, yet constrained enough to never feel dangerous. That is the most efficient way to waste potential. Nothing dramatic breaks. Nothing obvious fails. Everything simply stays smaller than it should be, including you. At some point, you convinced yourself that restraint was maturity. You learned how to manage expectations so well that even your own dreams learned to whisper. You began editing your thoughts before they ever reached your mouth, filtering ambition through what would be acceptable rather than what would be true. This is how people slowly abandon the parts of themselves that once felt alive. They do not betray their values in loud moments. They do it quietly by choosing ease over challenge, approval over respect, familiarity over growth. You became very good at explaining why now was not the moment, why conditions were not ideal, why you needed more preparation. Preparation became a comfortable hiding place. It let you feel productive without ever forcing exposure. The mind loves this trick because it protects the ego while starving the spirit. Deep down, you sensed the cost. You felt it in those moments when silence followed an opportunity, when you watched someone else act on a thought you had weeks earlier. That sting was not jealousy. It was recognition. It was your own unused courage reflecting back at you through someone else's action. Each time you ignored that feeling, you trained yourself to accept a narrower existence. Not because you lacked ability, but because you delayed belief until it felt safe. Safety, however, has never created anything worth remembering. There is a difference between patience and avoidance, and you crossed that line long ago without noticing. Patience moves with purpose. Avoidance disguises itself as discipline while quietly draining your edge. You told yourself you were being realistic, but realism became a convenient mask for doubt. You stopped stretching your identity and started protecting it. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. When a person protects their identity, they avoid risks that might challenge who they think they are. When a person stretches their identity, they accept discomfort as proof of expansion. You chose protection. It kept you intact but contained. You learned how to stay competent instead of becoming formidable. You learned how to blend into rooms instead of shifting their energy. None of this happened because you were incapable. It happened because you mistook stillness for strength. Real strength creates friction. It disrupts patterns. It attracts resistance. Somewhere along the way, you decided resistance meant you were doing something wrong, when it was often a sign you were finally doing something right. The world does not push back against what is harmless. It only tests what carries weight. By avoiding that pressure, you also avoided discovering how solid you truly are. You have spent years underestimating how much space you are allowed to take up. You learned to ask for permission in rooms where you should have been setting the tone. You learned to negotiate your own worth down before anyone else had the chance. This habit becomes invisible because it feels polite, even noble. But politeness that costs you your presence is not virtue. It is erasure. Every time you softened a truth to keep the peace, you taught others how to treat your voice. Every time you held back an idea because it felt too bold, you trained the world to expect less from you. People respond to what you consistently present, not to what you secretly hold. If you show restraint, you will be handled gently and dismissed easily. If you show conviction, you will be challenged and remembered. You cannot ask to be taken seriously while behaving as if your own thoughts require approval. The shift begins when you stop waiting for external validation and start acting as if your perspective has already earned its place. That is not arrogance. That is alignment. It is the quiet confidence that comes from deciding that your internal standard matters more than external comfort. Once that decision is made, your posture changes, your words land differently, your presence stops apologizing for existing. There is an unspoken grief that follows people who outgrow their environment but refuse to leave it. They feel restless without understanding why. They feel irritated by small things. They feel bored by conversations that once felt stimulating. This is not dissatisfaction with life. It is dissatisfaction with containment. Your current patterns no longer match your internal capacity, and that mismatch creates tension. Many people medicate that tension with distraction. Others label it burnout. Few recognize it for what it is, a signal that the version of you who adapted to survive is no longer enough to lead. You do not need more motivation. You need permission to outgrow the identity that kept you safe. Growth at this stage will feel aggressive, not gentle. It will require you to disappoint expectations you once worked hard to meet. It will demand that you stop being relatable to people who benefit from your predictability. This is where many retreat, because they confuse familiarity with loyalty. They stay where they are understood rather than stepping into a space where they are tested. Yet no one discovers their true range in places designed for comfort. Capacity reveals itself under pressure, not approval. You have learned to measure progress by how little disruption it causes. That metric has kept you stable but stagnant. Meaningful expansion creates ripples. It alters dynamics. It forces renegotiation of roles. When you change, people around you must update how they relate to you, and not everyone is willing to do that work. Some will resist. Some will mock. Some will attempt to remind you of who you used to be. This is not because you are wrong to change. It is because your growth threatens their understanding of themselves. You cannot manage that for them. Trying to remain digestible for others is how you stay trapped in a version of yourself that no longer fits. The moment you stop adjusting your size to make others comfortable, you reclaim energy you did not realize you were spending. That energy sharpens your focus. It strengthens your decisions. It gives your actions a weight they have been missing. You stop asking whether something is allowed and start asking whether it aligns. That single shift replaces hesitation with clarity. Clarity does not remove fear, but it makes fear irrelevant. You move anyway, not recklessly, but decisively. The mind adapts faster than pride wants to admit. Whatever you ask of it repeatedly becomes the standard it prepares for. When you choose minimal effort, safe routines, predictable outcomes, your brain quietly rewires itself around that ceiling. It stops scanning for higher rotes. It stops allocating energy for bigger moves. Not because it hates you, but because it serves you too well. It learns what you demand and optimizes for that level. This is why comfort feels natural after long exposure. You did not wake up one day deciding to limit yourself. You trained that response through repetition. Each time you avoided pressure, each time you chose ease over stretch, each time you settled for familiar territory, your nervous system logged the data. It adjusted expectations downward. Over time, that adjustment became identity. You started to feel like someone who prefers less intensity, fewer risks, smaller arenas. That feeling was not truth, it was conditioning. The danger is not a single small choice. The danger is the accumulation of them until your inner world expects less effort before you even begin. Neural efficiency is ruthless in its logic. It rewards what you practice, not what you fantasize about. You can visualize growth endlessly, but if your actions stay modest, your brain prepares for modest outcomes. Energy flows toward what gets used. Circuits that fire often become dominant. Circuits that remain idle fade into the background. This process does not wait for motivation. It does not care about potential. It responds only to demand. When your daily life lacks challenge, your mind becomes efficient at maintaining a narrow range of behavior. Decision-making shrinks. Risk tolerance drops. Even curiosity becomes selective. You begin to confuse peace with stagnation because your system has learned that stillness equals safety. This is how low demand hardens into default settings. You wake up already calibrated for restraint. Not tired, not broken, just underloaded. The tragedy is subtle. You still function. You still progress slightly. But the internal machinery that once craved expansion now runs on maintenance mode. That is how capacity goes unused without pain loud enough to force change. Identity does not form from what you say about yourself. It forms from what you repeatedly ask yourself to handle. If your life rarely asks you to rise, your self-image adjusts accordingly. You begin to see challenge as disruption rather than opportunity. You label bold moves as unnecessary stress. That framing protects you from discomfort while quietly shrinking your range. Over time, you stop trusting yourself with larger responsibilities because you have not rehearsed them. Confidence is not an abstract trait. It is memory. It is the record of what you have faced and survived. When that record stays thin, your self-assessment follows. You start negotiating downward before the world ever challenges you. This is how people talk themselves out of rooms they have already earned entry into, not through fear alone, but through a learned expectation of limitation. Once that expectation settles in, it colors perception. You notice reasons to hold back faster than reasons to advance. The mind does not resist this. It prefers predictability over expansion. Low-demand lifestyles feel deceptively calm. There is less friction, fewer conflicts, fewer moments of exposure. But beneath that calm, something vital goes dormant. The part of you designed to respond under pressure loses sharpness. Focus dulls. Reaction time slows. Even ambition becomes theoretical. You think about change instead of feeling pulled toward it. This is not a moral failure. It is a biological response to insufficient stimulus. Systems that are not stressed do not strengthen, they conserve. When conservation becomes the norm, growth feels foreign. Effort feels heavier than it should. That heaviness convinces you that you are not built for more. In reality, you have simply not demanded more recently. The mind mistakes disuse for inability. It labels unused capacity as absence. This is why stepping back into challenge initially feels overwhelming. You are not starting from zero. You are reactivating systems that went quiet. The discomfort is not proof of inadequacy. It is proof of awakening. The brain expects tomorrow to resemble yesterday. That expectation shapes behavior before conscious thought intervenes. If yesterday was cautious, tomorrow will be prepared for caution. If yesterday was restrained, tomorrow will default to restraint. This loop runs quietly, efficiently, without drama. Breaking it requires interrupting expectation with action that contradicts the pattern. Thinking differently does not suffice. The system recalibrates only after experience. When you place yourself in situations that demand more presence, more decision-making, more exposure, the brain adapts upward just as easily as it adapted downward. But it will not do so on promises. It requires proof. Each time you meet a higher demand and remain intact, the internal forecast updates. Capacity expands, identity shifts. You begin to recognize yourself as someone who operates at a higher baseline. That recognition changes posture, speech, timing. You stop hesitating as long. You stop explaining as much. Not because you became someone new, but because you remembered what you were capable of before you taught yourself to expect less. Many people confuse intentional restraint with discipline. Discipline directs energy toward a goal. Restraint without direction simply reduces output. When you avoid challenge without a clear purpose, you are not conserving strength. You are lowering the bar. The nervous system reads that signal clearly. It interprets avoidance as preference. Preference becomes prediction. Prediction becomes identity. This chain forms without conscious agreement. That is why years can pass before someone realizes they have been living beneath their range. Nothing obvious breaks. Life simply feels flatter. The absence of urgency feels like peace until it starts feeling hollow. That hollowness is the mind craving higher demand. It wants something to organize around. Pressure gives structure. Without it, attention scatters, energy leaks. You remain busy but unfocused. Rest does not restore because there is nothing worthy to recover for. That is the cost of sustained smallness. Not failure, but dilution. Raising demand does not require chaos or recklessness. It requires selecting arenas that ask more of you than comfort allows. Speaking when silence is easier. Deciding when delay feels safer. Taking responsibility where excuses once lived. These moves recalibrate the brain faster than any affirmation. The system responds immediately to increased load. Focus sharpens. Time perception changes. You feel more present because the stakes require it. Over time, what once felt intense becomes normal. The baseline rises. This is how people grow into larger versions of themselves without dramatic transformation. It is a training effect. Just as low-demand conditions shrink capacity, sustained challenge expands it. The difference lies in what you consistently choose to carry. You cannot think your way into a higher identity. You must behave your way there. Action sets the expectation. Expectation reshapes identity. Untrained thinking does not announce itself as a problem. It feels familiar, even reasonable. It sounds like your own voice because it has been echoing in your head for years without resistance. These thoughts arrive fully formed, carrying explanations for why certain actions feel unrealistic, why certain outcomes feel reserved for others, why certain paths feel closed before you even step near them. You rarely question these internal statements because they feel old, and age often masquerades as truth. The brain loves efficiency. It prefers recycling conclusions over re-examining them. So it takes early assumptions, past failures, borrowed opinions, and half-remembered warnings, then loops them endlessly. Over time, repetition gives them authority. They become the background music of your decisions. You stop hearing them consciously, yet they guide every move. This is how invisible ceilings form. Not through external force, but through unchecked internal repetition. When thinking remains untrained, it defaults to preservation, not expansion. It avoids uncertainty, labels challenge as threat, and protects the version of you that feels manageable. That protection feels helpful until you realize it has been quietly deciding the size of your life for you. Most limits you respect have never been tested properly. They were introduced during moments of fear, embarrassment, or confusion, then stored as permanent truths. The mind does not discard these conclusions on its own. It keeps them because they once reduced discomfort. That reduction came at a cost you were too young or too distracted to notice. Over time, these limits harden into beliefs about what you can handle, what you deserve, what you are suited for. You plan around them. You set goals that never threaten them. You call that realism. In reality, it is habit. The brain repeats what it has not been challenged on, because challenge requires energy and attention. Without deliberate intervention, thought patterns simply run. They do not evolve, they just loop. When a new opportunity appears, the old script steps in to interpret it. When pressure increases, the same internal warnings surface. Nothing new is evaluated. Everything is filtered through yesterday's conclusions. This is not wisdom. It is inertia wearing the costume of experience. Untrained thinking relies heavily on memory instead of observation. It reacts based on what happened before rather than what is happening now. That distinction matters. Memory is biased toward safety because it remembers pain vividly and success selectively. When you do not actively question your interpretations, the mind fills gaps with caution. It assumes similarity where difference exists. It treats unfamiliar situations as repeats of old failures. That assumption keeps you anchored to an outdated self-image. You become loyal to conclusions made by a version of you who lacked information, skill, or perspective.